Hello, Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Welcome to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. This centurion from the Roman Empire deserves a favor from Jesus. He loves the Jewish people, he's kind to them, and he even built them a synagogue. If anyone deserves a favor from Jesus, shouldn't it be him? Well, that's not exactly how things work with Jesus. As benevolent and kind and generous as this centurion may have been portrayed, Jesus is not a transactional savior. You can't expect God to move on your behalf based solely on your good deeds and good works. Kindness, humility, generosity, modesty, and meekness are all great virtues. But those virtues don't move God on your behalf. If you want God to move on your behalf, it'll take faith. In this case, the centurion knows faith can heal, and he demonstrates humble faith. Faith was the key for this centurion, and it's the key for us today. Some of the ideas surrounding this week's text include the terms Gentile and slavery. Now, if you have Wi-Fi in your church Sunday school classroom or wherever you share this lesson, this channel is a good way to discuss and teach this week's lesson. What I provide is a concise overview of background, context, characters, and themes and topics that gets to the point, saves you time, and enhances your own teaching and study. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. But the only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. So please subscribe, like, comment, and then click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. I'd also like to thank all of the new subscribers to this channel. I'm grateful that you thought enough of what's here to subscribe. So thank you. And if you want to support this work, I accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road, Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia, 30315. So with that said, welcome again to SundaySchoolPreacher.com, and let's go to work. First, we'll look at the background for today's text. The Gospel according to Luke is the third of the four Gospels. It's also the third of three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The synoptic Gospels tell much of the same stories, use much of the same sources, and tell those stories in much the same way. The Gospel according to John is not synoptic, and it tells somewhat different stories and tells them in a different way. Nelson's Bible Handbook notes that the author does not identify himself by name, but he does tell us a good deal about himself. Most people understand Luke to be a physician and a writer with excellent command of the Greek language. Nelson also notes that Luke was likely written sometime after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. Some scholars suggest it was written about 80 or 90 AD, but neither the exact date nor the true author is known. Luke is also known as a gospel written for the Gentiles. Nelson's notes that Luke is the most socially minded of the Gospels. In it, Jesus blesses the poor, the hungry, those who weep, and the excluded. This 7th chapter of Luke begins with the story of Jesus healing a centurion's servant. While the text calls him a servant, I should note that the text is referring to the centurion's slave. Additionally, this is the same story in Matthew, the 8th chapter, verses 5 through 13. In the Matthew 8th chapter version, the servant is referred to as a slave. Townsend commentary explains that Matthew, the 8th chapter, verse 6, describes the servant as lying at home, paralyzed, in terrible distress. While Townsend notes that slaves in the New Testament period were not mistreated as a rule, Dr. Mitzi J. Smith explains in True to Our Native Land, an African American New Testament commentary, that slavery under Roman Empire was no different from other slave societies in the cruel and inhumane treatment of slaves. She continues, slave owners regularly forced slaves and criminals to fight against gladiators and wild beasts in the arena, and that even with legislation against cruel treatment of slaves, it was the slave owners who determined what was extreme cruelty. The point is, we should not think of New Testament enslavement as somehow more benevolent or less cruel than American chattel enslavement. I should also note that this text provides an example of why translations matter. In verse 2, the King James Version interprets the centurion's sentiment toward his slave as a servant who was dear to him. That's the King James Version, a servant who was dear to him. The New Revised Standard Version interprets his sentiment toward the enslaved as someone the centurion valued highly. I think differently about something that's dear to me than I do about something that I value highly. Something that's dear to me is usually a person. Something that's valued highly is usually a thing, not a person. In this text, the centurion is a Roman official. The Israelites are under the rule of an oppressive Roman Empire. Yet even in the midst of oppression, this text highlights a supporter or a patron among the oppressors. Townsend commentary notes that people often have faith in others based on their good reputation. Clearly, Jesus' reputation preceded him in the case of this Roman centurion, both believing and acting on his belief in the authority of Jesus. The centurion knows that with Jesus, faith can heal. Some important words to consider from this text include Gentile and slavery. So let's review last week and see how it connects to this week. Last week's lesson focused on the faithfulness of both the widow of Zarephath and Elijah the prophet. The lesson began at 1 Kings, the 17th chapter, verse 8, with an often used phrase in the Old Testament. The word of the Lord came to me. This phrase indicates the reader should pay special attention because God is about to speak. In verse 9, the Lord told Elijah to go to Zarephath, which was a city near Sidon on the Phoenician coast. The Lord told Elijah to live there because the Lord had commended a widow who lived there to feed him. The NISB explains that God sent Elijah among the Phoenicians, which was the center of Baal worship, to demonstrate that even in the land of Baal, the Lord was sovereign. In other words, God was sending Elijah away from the land of Israel into a foreign land, and ultimately, God would show that the one true and living God was God outside Israel also. I explained that it was important to note two things. First, the Lord had already commanded a widow to take care of Elijah. And secondly, the widow lived in the heart of Baal worship territory, so she was likely not a worshiper of Elijah's God. She probably worshiped Baal. I noted that Townsend commentary explains that the Old Testament portrays God as being particularly concerned for the widow, the orphan, and the poor. That is, the vulnerable and marginalized in society. In chapter 17, we saw God using a woman who most likely didn't even know she was the one true and living God. Oh, she didn't even know who the one true and living God was. But yet, God uses this woman to show sovereignty. I made the point that God can use whomever God wants to use. God can deliver whomever God wants to deliver. And just because someone doesn't do religion the way you do religion doesn't mean God doesn't care for them. In verse 10, Elijah went to Zarephath. When he arrived at the gate of the city, the unnamed widow was there gathering sticks. Elijah asked her for a drink of water. In verse 11, as she was going to get the water, Elijah asked her for a morsel of bread. In verse 12, the unnamed widow said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug." Elijah had traveled all that distance only to discover that this woman God commanded to feed him only had a handful of meal. She told Elijah that she was gathering a few sticks so she could go home, prepare her meal for herself and her son, and then eat it and die. This unnamed widow was in a terrible situation. She only had a handful of food left, and she literally had no hope of living beyond her last meal. She'd given up hope and had no one and nowhere to turn to for help. I noted that Townsend commentary explained that the status of widows in ancient Israelite society was precarious, having no inheritance rights and often in want of life's necessities. The widow was exposed to harsh treatment and exploitation. In verse 13, Elijah told her, "Don't be afraid. Go and do as you've said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son." In this verse, it is this verse that strikes me as a powerful way to show Elijah's faithfulness also. Elijah had to know that God would provide. What man in his right mind would dare ask a woman who is about to make her last meal for her only child to feed him first? This took faith on Elijah's part. He had to know that God was going to take care of this woman and her son. In verses 14 and 15, Elijah told the widow, "The Lord, the God of Israel, says the jar of meal will not be emptied and the jug of oil will not fail until the Lord sends rain on the earth." The unnamed widow did as Elijah said, so that Elijah and her household ate for many days. This woman deserved every bit of credit due her for not just listening to the man of God, but truly believing that God would be her provider. Can you imagine what your mother might have said to someone who told her to feed them first, when she knew all she had was a small handful of food? The faith of this unnamed widow was astounding. She really believed. She believed the man of God, and she believed that God would take care of her and her son. Verse 16 closed the lesson, helping us to know that God did provide The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that Elijah spoke. The unnamed widow only had a handful of meal and a little oil, but God made her little bit last a long time. God multiplied her little to become much. Beloved, that's good news for us today. You might not have much in your own eyes, but what you do have, God can use it and make it last. Last week, both the widow of Zarephath and Elijah's response to God's faithfulness was demonstrated by their trust in God's provision. They both had active faith, and they were both blessed for faithfulness. God took Elijah to a foreign land among foreign people who worshiped a foreign god. But God's sovereignty didn't end at the borders of Israel. Even in Phoenicia, God was sovereign and showed his power through a nameless widow by saving her and the life of her son. This week, we see a Roman centurion who is a supporter to the Jewish people, demonstrating both humility and faith. The centurion is a man who understands the power of authority. Despite his great authority over Roman soldiers and as a Roman official, he recognizes the authority of Jesus to heal his valuable slave. Townsend and Boyd's commentaries titled this week's lesson, Faith Can Heal. Standard Commentary titles this week's lesson, Humble Faith. The scripture text comes from Luke, the 7th chapter, verses 1 through 10. I'll read that text for you now from the New Revised Standard Version. We begin with a section entitled, Jesus Heals a Centurion's Servant. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly, and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He's worthy of having you do this for him. For he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. So what takes place in this passage? Chapter 7 begins with Jesus having finished talking about loving your enemies, not judging or condemning others, and a parable about two foundations, all in chapter 6. When Jesus finished these sayings, he went into Capernaum. And I should note that Capernaum is his home and where he begins his earthly ministry. Matthew The 4th chapter explains that Jesus begins his ministry in Galilee. That's Matthew, the 4th chapter, verse 12. I'll read that for you. Matthew 4:12 reads, "Now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee. He left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled." In chapter 6 of Luke, Jesus calls his 12 disciples. He has now entered Capernaum, and this will become his home. Verse 2 explains that there is a centurion's slave whom his master valued highly that was sick and about to die. A centurion was a Roman soldier responsible for 100 men. That means he would have been an official of the Roman Empire and a man with substantial authority over the Jewish people and over his own soldiers. Dr. Mitzi J. Smith, in True to Our Native Land, an African American New Testament commentary, writes that when the centurion describes his slave as highly valued, or entimos, he refers to the slave's socioeconomic value. I highlight this detail because I think it's important to dispel the myth that American chattel enslavement was worse than New Testament enslavement, and vice versa. The Greek word used for slave or servant in some translations is doulos. The correct term is slave, and it's defined as a person who is legally owned by someone else and whose entire livelihood and purpose was determined by their master. Dr. Mitzi J. Smith also writes, the owner is eager. She's talking about this centurion. She writes, the owner is eager for Jesus to heal his servant because of the loss of revenue resulting from the slave's sickness and inactivity. I should note that Townsend commentary explains centurions who appear in the New Testament are generally shown to be men of positive character. As I noted in the background section, an enslaved person in New Testament days would not have been treated any better than those enslaved in the American chattel system. In verse 3, the centurion hears about Jesus and sends Jewish elders to ask Jesus to come and heal his slave. The reputation of Jesus precedes him. This centurion knew about Jesus before even meeting Jesus. The centurion already knows that Jesus has the authority and is capable of healing his valuable enslaved possession. Evidently, the centurion has the clout or authority to send Jewish elders to Jesus on his behalf. In Matthew's recollection of this story, in Matthew, the 8th chapter, the centurion speaks directly to Jesus instead of sending Jewish elders on his behalf. In Matthew's recollection of this story, he speaks directly to Jesus. In verse 4, when the Jewish elders come to Jesus, they appealed to Jesus on behalf of the centurion. They wanted Jesus to know that the centurion was deserving of this miracle. I should note that this takes place in the early part of Jesus' ministry. It was only in chapter 6 that Jesus called his 12 disciples. Yet his fame is already spreading. The Jews who come to Jesus evidently believe Jesus can heal the servant also. Verse 5 explains why the Jewish elders believe the centurion deserves this miracle. They explain to Jesus, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. In verse 6, Jesus goes with the elders, the Jewish elders. When Jesus was not far from the centurion's house, the centurion sent friends to tell Jesus not to trouble himself, because he didn't deserve to have Jesus under his roof. This centurion's humility cannot be diminished. He is a man of authority, yet he recognizes, despite his own great authority, the authority of Jesus was far superior. In verse 7, the centurion explains that he didn't come personally to Jesus because he didn't see himself as worthy. And this next statement is what really sets this centurion apart. He says, "But say the word, and my servant will be healed." Not only is the centurion demonstrating humility, he's also demonstrating faith. This centurion believes in the power of Jesus. He believes faith can heal. In verse 8, the centurion explains that he is a man under authority with soldiers and servants, that he can tell to go and come and to do, and they'll do what he tells them to do. The centurion wants Jesus to know that despite his own authority, he respects the authority of Jesus. Having faith is having confidence or trust in a person. I often pray that I've placed my faith, my trust, and my confidence in Jesus and Jesus alone. While this centurion might have been kind to the Jewish people, his kindness was not what moved Jesus. Even though he may have been generous by having their synagogue built for them, it wasn't his generosity that moved Jesus. What moved Jesus was the centurion's faith. This wasn't wishful thinking. It was a deep conviction that Jesus was the man who could and would make his slave well. The centurion had an expectation that all Jesus needed to do was say the word. In verse 9, after hearing this centurion's faith, Jesus was amazed. Townsend notes that this is one of two places in the Gospels where Jesus is said to be amazed. Jesus is amazed here in Capernaum by faith, and in Nazareth by unbelief. You can check Luke, the 7th chapter, verse 9, and Mark, the 6th chapter, verse 6. Verse 10 concludes the lesson, helping us to know that Jesus did, in fact, heal the slave. When the men returned to the house, they found the servant well. Jesus spoke the word, and the slave was healed. So let's give the text some context. After being kind and generous to the Jewish people by building them a synagogue, one might think the centurion would have thought himself worthy of a favor from Jesus. Yet he thinks himself unworthy of Jesus to even come under his roof. Humility, modesty, and meekness are great virtues. They're in contrast to arrogance, conceit, and pride. The centurion demonstrated these admirable virtues in ways most people can only hope for. After all, he was a man of substantial authority. He was known to love the Jewish people, and he even committed valuable resources to have their synagogue built. If anyone should deserve a favor, shouldn't it be him? But that's the thing about Jesus. It's not a transactional relationship. Jesus doesn't do for us because he owes us one. What motivates God to move on our behalf is our faith. Faith can heal. This centurion had humble faith. Let's strive to do likewise and live a life in humble submission to God's purpose and direction for our own lives. Key characters in the text. Of course, Jesus is the key character, Jesus of Nazareth, as the Messiah and, according to the Christian Church, the incarnate second person of the Trinity. He was crucified on a cross and raised from the dead by the power of God. His followers worship him and seek to obey his will. And of course, the other key character is the centurion. And a centurion is defined as the commander of a century, or 100 soldiers, which is the smallest unit of the Roman army. Key words in the text. Not necessarily in the text, but good for discussion anyway. One key word would be Gentile, and Luke's gospel is written to the Gentiles. A Gentile is defined as a term used by Jews for one who is not Jewish by racial origin. In the Old Testament, the nations is used. Another key term might be slavery. Slavery is defined as a condition of involuntary servitude. While slavery was practiced during biblical times, the emergence of biblical principles and eventually Christian ethical views that recognized the evils of slavery as a social phenomenon have led to its condemnation in many countries. Themes, topics, discussion, or sermon preparation ideas. One might be virtues of an important man. And then secondly, another one might be you deserve a favor. Questions that you might ask your listeners. Why does it matter that New Testament enslavement was not different than American chattel slavery? Then a second question might be, the centurion was a Gentile. Is that an important detail in this story? And a concluding thought. I saw this YouTube video of Nelson Mandela explaining the importance of humility. As my concluding thought, I'll leave a link to that video. It says what I wanted to say so much better. After this video, after my video finishes, don't click off yet. After my video finishes, check the description section or the comment section for a link to this video of Nelson Mandela explaining the importance of humility. And then a preview of next week's lesson. Next week's lesson continues in the same chapter in this book of Luke. It skips down to the 37th verse and continues through the 48th verse. Next week, I discuss the very touching story of a woman who washes the feet of Jesus with her tears. The lesson is entitled, Faith Saves. Again, if you want to support this work, I do accept correspondence and gifts at 1590 Jonesboro Road, Southeast, Box 150032, Atlanta, Georgia, 30315. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I am Reverend Dexter Alexander, and you've been listening to SundaySchoolPreacher.com. The only way I know this is helpful is if you subscribe, click the like button, or say so in the comments. Please also click the notifications bell so you'll be notified as soon as I upload next week's lesson. And if you don't mind, please share this site with other Sunday school teachers, preachers, and students. Thank you, and may God bless you real good.